Well, hello and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 1 of The Silver Chair, Behind the Gem. Well, welcome to season 4, Phil.
Yeah, good to be here. We're back.
Book number 4 in the Chronicles of Narnia, The Silver Chair. We've got some new characters. We've got unexplored lands. I think in some ways this is the newest the series has felt since the first book.
Yeah, I feel like there's something about a movie not being made, at least a recent movie. I think there was a BBC version of this, but...
Oh, there is, and we are going to talk about it eventually.
Yeah. I think it'll be even more exaggerated when we get to the fifth book, but right now this feels like uncharted territory.
It feels kind of like this is like a soft reboot of the series. It's obviously not, but it does feel like with the introduction of Jill and even the way that Eustace is introduced, it almost feels like this is an appropriate place to kind of jump into the story, even if you haven't read the other 3. Obviously, it works best if you have, but I could see, handing this to one of my students or a friend and them still being able to catch on for the most part.
Yeah, he does a good job of moving quickly, getting into the action very quickly, and not relying too much on what's happened before.
And so before we talk about this chapter, we should mention, I know a lot of times we have new listeners who find us here in our season premieres. So Phil, can you just explain a little bit about what we do on the podcast and kind of what our background is with the books?
Yeah, so we've always described ourselves as Narnia novices. We don't come at this from a scholarly place, although I do feel like we're getting better and better each season because we have more knowledge, we've talked to more people, and we have a better perspective. But we go through chapter by chapter, and we just unpack what's there. And we sometimes will bring on special guests. We'll actually have one for the next episode. And we try to figure out what else is there in this story that maybe we didn't see the first time when we read it as kids.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great way to put it because there's so many things about these books, all 7 of them, that as we dive further into them, we find so much more beauty than we ever thought there was before. And so I'll remind listeners that you have not read this book before, or at least as an adult. I read it a couple of years ago, and I have a little bit clearer of an idea of where we're going with the plot, whereas, I won't even finish that sentence. Phil, what do you remember about reading this book as a kid?
Well, I thought I remembered quite a bit, but if I zoom out and look at it objectively, I really only remember one scene. And
what is that scene?
That's the scene where there's someone in a chair and he's crying out.
So you don't know what that person is, or who you just remember this image?
Yeah. And to be honest, the image is probably from the movie, but I do remember having this book read to me. And I remember what the cover looked like because we had the 70s version, the box set with the numbers all wrong. Or no, yeah. Maybe they were right. Maybe they were still right at that point.
Yeah, and we will not get into the reading order debate right now, but I will point new listeners to a video by Brian over at NarniaWeb.com. I'll put it in the episode's description, and that will hopefully illuminate some of the confusion for new listeners about why this is sometimes the 4th and sometimes the 6th book in the series. Phil, I think it's time. We should dive into this chapter. You ready?
Let's go.
All right, so we left off last season at the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and in that, Edmund, Lucy, and Eustace returned back to our world from Narnia. Edmund and Lucy were told they would not be returning, but it was left unclear what would happen to Eustace. It is an odd chapter, which means it is my turn to summarize the story in 150 words or less. Here we go. A young girl named Jill Pole is crying behind the gym of her school. While she is crying, one of her peers shows up and attempts to encourage her. Jill comments that he has changed substantially over the summer. The boy's name is Eustace. Eustace tells Jill that he visited a magical country and explains that they might be able to get there by asking its ruler, Aslan. Jill and Eustace call out Aslan's name, but they are interrupted by a group of bullies. As they run away, they come across a door that leads to the magical world. Both children pass through the door. Once they are on the other side, they notice an immense precipice. Jill tries to act brave, but when Eustace tries to keep her from falling, he falls off the cliff himself. Jill is left on top of the cliff alone until she sees a lion.
Well done. Great introduction.
I'm going to be honest, this was a hard chapter summary for me to write because as I was reading this chapter, now thinking back to the last 3 books that we've covered, Lewis's voice here in this chapter is markedly different from the voice that he has used in the first 3 books. And I want to see if this stays the same throughout this whole book. Even the way that Eustace is introduced here, he's introduced by his last name. He's more of a supporting character, whereas Jill is more of our protagonist here. And I think that catches me off guard because you would think that the one character that we are familiar with, Eustace, would be the protagonist while Jill would be the new supporting character. But instead, Lewis subverts our expectations and flips those two. Did you notice that?
I did, and I thought it was an interesting way to do it. It does feel like I'm not sure what the intention was behind it, but it feels like he knew he was going to have Eustace in here, but he didn't want the focus to be on him. And it's even kind of like a fun surprise the way he's revealed. It's like when they do a prequel to any movie, and they have this character show up, and they don't quite show you who it is, and then they kind of turn the camera around, and you see who it actually is.
Are you thinking of a particular movie? That was very specific.
I feel like they did this in one of the second Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them movie.
Okay.
When they revealed Dumbledore. Spoiler alert. And
oh yeah, I forgot about. I've tried to block that movie out of my mind.
Yeah, I feel like even with Tarkin a little bit, they kind of show them from behind, and then they have them.
Oh, in Rogue
around.
One, yeah. Okay, so I you're right. There is that kind of same feeling there where, and it's so funny because this time in the last book, in the first chapter, we would not think that just one book later we'd be so excited and happy to see Eustace, right. When at the beginning of Dawn Treader we're disgusted with him.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and jump into our read through here. So the chapter opens up with the introduction of Jill and the experiment house. And C.S. Lewis, he does not hold back here.
Yeah, he's got some opinions.
He does. And I think it's good for us, it's a good place for us to unpack a little bit of Lewis's thoughts on modern education. So this book was published in 1953, right? 1953, and so Lewis is thinking especially of education at the time there. I wonder what his thoughts would be now in 2020. But I thought we should talk a little bit about this. I won't jump on any kind of soapbox. I know that obviously I've talked about before that I teach at a classical Christian school, but I'm not anti-modern education or anything like that. But I wanted to give you a quote, Phil, which is from Lewis. It's from The Abolition of Man, and I want to read this because I think it gives us a better idea of what Lewis's thoughts are on education, even outside of the silver chair here. Here's what he has to say. Where the old education initiated, the new merely conditions. The old dealt with its pupils as grown birds deal with young birds when they teach them to fly. The new deals with them more as the poultry keeper deals with young birds, making them thus for purposes of which the birds know nothing. In a word, the old was kind of propagation, men transmitting manhood to men. The new is merely propaganda. Oof.
Wow.
That is a pretty scathing critique of modern education from our author here.
So when do you think that shift happened? He must have been happy with his education, and now we're in the 50s. What do you think was behind that?
Well, I think, I'm not, an expert on any of these things, but there does seem to be a large shift in education, particularly in Britain, during and after the Industrial Revolution. There's a really famous British educator named Charlotte Mason who lived into the 20th century but did a lot of her work at the end of the 19th century. And she would have shared a lot of thoughts with Lewis. I don't think they ever met each other and knew each other. But she kind of looks at, I won't get into all of it now. I don't know if people really are interested in that, but she talks a lot about how this shift away from more of a classical to what we'd call modern and now, postmodern education happens she makes a lot of connections between the Industrial Revolution and the change to a more like what we now think of when we think of a classic, not classic as in classical, but like the common schoolroom where you have K through 12 in different classes and that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
It does. My theory is always that we needed more people in the factories. We needed more people like kind of as cogs in the bigger machine.
Yeah.
And so like now education becomes like you sit here and you do this all day. You don't move around as much. You stay in one spot. And kind of like creating a pipeline from the schools to the quote factories.
Yeah.
And then it kind of exacerbated even more by war. So they realized how important technology was in war, and now they like, why do you think we study calculus and like almost everything seems to be about making rockets. And that's an exaggeration, but
yeah,
I just think it's funny how like these big world events influence education.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we should point listeners in the direction of two works that I think help give a better idea about Lewis's thoughts on education if someone's interested. Because, I mean, like I said, at the beginning, Lewis says, they're it's a co-educational or a mixed school, but it's not nearly as mixed as the minds of the people who ran it. So, I mean, Lewis has pretty strong words about it. And then I don't want to spoil anything. But at the end of the book, he has more things to say as well about Experiment House. So I know I can't spoil anything else for you, Phil. But I will point listeners in the direction of one book called C.S. Lewis, An Apologist for Education. It's by a professor named Louis Marcos. And another essay called The Lost Tools of Learning by Dorothy Sayers, who was a contemporary of Lewis. And you and I got to hear Crystal Downing, who works over at the Wade Center at Wheaton College. We got to hear her talk a lot about Dorothy Sayers back last November at the C.S. Lewis Symposium. And so one is a book about Lewis and his thoughts on education, and the other is an essay by a contemporary of Lewis's called The Lost Tools of Learning, and that's Dorothy Sayers. So I'll link those down in the description. I think they're great places to start if you're interested more. And obviously, also The Abolition of Man, which is written by Lewis himself, is a great way to get an idea of kind of what Lewis thought. If you're someone who's, I think for a lot of people, you might hear this and be like, well, that's a pretty scathing thing. Like, what's wrong with having boys and girls work together and learn together? I mean, I think most of us, myself included, went to and work in, if we are educators, schools that are coeducational. And so it just gives you a better idea of where Lewis is coming from, even if you don't agree with him on all of these things. So I'll link all those in the description.
Cool.
We also should mention here, as Lewis brings up the idea of bullies running rampant at the school, between the last season, we had Lena Maslow on the show who wrote Through the Wardrobe, and she talked about how Lewis had a pretty rough experience, which you can also read about in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. And so Lewis seems to really be putting a lot of his own thoughts and experiences in just to the first few pages of The Silver Chair. I mean, that really stood out to me.
Yeah.
So, Phil, what happens next as Jill decides it's time to stop crying and she meets a new friend?
Yeah, so Eustace comes up behind her and they have this entire conversation just about dealing with this group, and they call them them. And it's
capitalized then, yeah.
I feel like Lewis really liked to capitalize letters. What do you think?
I do think he likes to play with grammar in a way that expresses his opinion or his ideas in ways that they have to be completely inferred. Like, he doesn't say, much about them, but the fact that he's capitalized it here means this is a kind of a stable group of people. It's not just some lowercase common pronoun here. It's a actual group, right? And he communicates all that literally just by capitalizing a letter, which is brilliant writing on his part.
Right. Yeah, so Eustace starts to talk to her, and she's in a pretty bad mood. And Eustace very quickly changes the subject and decides that they're both kind of in the same spot. He's going to tell her about Narnia and about Aslan.
And it's so interesting to hear this from Jill's perspective, because Eustace, spent so much of the Dawn Treader, about half of the book, being in Narnia and still not believing he was in Narnia. Where's the British consul?
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on. And yet Eustace has become a very unexpected evangelist for Narnia. Paul Karkanen, who we've gone back to a couple of times in his book, Narnia, Unlocking the Wardrobe, talks about, how unexpected it is that Eustace would now be evangelizing to Jill about Narnia.
Yeah. And I think that we see this happen in when someone becomes a Christian too. And I think Lewis was pretty against a lot of the stuff that he ended up believing in later, and became one of the most common entry points for a lot of people, I think.
That's so true. And, it wasn't until this last year that I spent any time looking at Lewis's poetry. And shout out to Don King, who, has done such a great job curating so much of Lewis's work, and reading some of his poetry before he was a Christian, or before he was even a deist, when he was a pretty staunch atheist. I mean, it's some rough stuff to work through. I mean, he's pretty scathing in some of the ways that he discusses religion and all these other things. And so it's so interesting to see that shift. And so I wonder if Lewis himself, who is a well-known apologist for the Christian religion, I wonder if he is kind of putting a little bit of himself into Eustace there.
I would think so.
Yeah. So in this conversation that Eustace and Jill have, there's one thing I just wanted to point out. I don't have like any kind of commentary on it or anything, but Jill's still pretty upset, and he hands her a peppermint just to kind of this, I don't know, it's just this like sign of care towards her that, oh, you know what, here, what you need is a little peppermint here. And it's such a gentle side of Eustace that it almost feels like this is a brand new character.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to talk to you about that. How did you read the sentence after he offers her a peppermint?
He had one too? How did I read it?
So at first I read it as he offered her a peppermint. He had one too.
Oh.
I was like, well, that's probably why I offered her one. And then I realized, I was like,
he's giving it. He's also taking a peppermint himself.
He has two peppermints. He's giving one to her, and he's gonna have one.
Yeah, it's this this just gentle kind of gesture from Eustace that is so different than the Eustace we know, and this kind of gift, this offering that Eustace gives to Jill, it makes me really excited to explore their relationship over the course of this book, because this is the first book in the series where our, two people who enter Narnia, the people from our world, they really don't know each other that well. I mean, they're classmates, but it doesn't seem like they were friends. In fact, they refer to each other regularly by their last name as opposed to their first. They're not even, they have a kind of an air of formality to them, if you will. And it makes me excited to have two people who really aren't very close going into Narnia together, which is a pretty strong juxtaposition of four siblings who, spend their entire lives together going into Narnia. What do you make of Jill so far, Phil?
She seems pretty upset, but justified for being upset, for a good reason. But she's also very willing to kind of follow along and go to this new place, or try to get to the new place. And we'll find out a little bit more about her toward the end of the chapter, but she's also it sounds like she has some abilities that other people don't have. She's not afraid of heights, that seems unique. But it also gets her in a little bit of trouble. So I'm interested to see what she'll be like at the end.
I think it gets Eustace in more trouble than it gets her into, but
yeah, but she's walking around with the fact that was kind of her fault.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's very true. So this conversation between Eustace and Jill continues, right? And it's so weird to hear Eustace, begrudgingly, that's not the right word, because he is a believer, if you will, right, in Narnia. But he's so not sure of himself. Like, this is the first time he's ever shared it with anyone. He's like, well, it's got like dragons and magic.
I was one of them.
And exactly. But then, in the midst of this kind of level of uncertainty that Eustace is giving off, he makes a very profound statement. He acknowledges that, maybe we could go there and we would need to cry out to Aslan, the ruler of the land. And Jill, makes the comment, is it like drawing circles on the ground? Or, what is it she says exactly?
Some strange letters.
Yeah, exactly. And then in the midst of that, Eustace says, this extremely insightful thing. But now that it comes to the point, I have an idea that all those circles and things are rather wrought. I don't think he'd like them. It would look as if we thought we could make him do things, but really, we can only ask him. What a profound statement from Eustace here.
Yeah, and it shows how much wisdom he's gained. And before, everything was kind of a demand. Before he was de-dragoned. Or undragoned, not de-dragoned.
Yeah, it's okay.
De-dragoned is a made-up word.
But undragoned, that's a real one.
That's a real one.
It is, right? And there's this level of humility, which I would say that even at the end of the Dawn Treader, after that undragoning, Eustace still is, I wouldn't say he's a humble character, right? He's a changed character, and he still has work to be done, but he's not necessarily humble. But this is a level of humility that is new for him, saying that really we can only ask. I have no control over Aslan, but we can go before him, we can ask. And there's many biblical allusions here that I think Lewis is pulling upon. That like it's not as if with God that we can tell him what to do, but we can ask. Jesus tells us that very clearly in the Gospels, right? Like we can ask and we'll receive. And Eustace has understood that at a young age.
Yes. I also think it's interesting the way he approaches telling Jill about Narnia and Aslan. He says it in kind of a hesitant way, and I think what's going on is he's aware of how it sounds. It comes across as a little crazy. Mm-hmm. But to him, he was there. He knows that it's real. And so he goes forward with it anyway. And I feel like that it makes it it's pretty similar to what it's like to share your faith, because like you know that it's real. Like you know that like Christ has worked on your heart, and you can feel the change, and you can feel his presence. But then to say it out loud sometimes, like you're aware of how it's going to come across mm-hmm. or how it might be received.
And it's almost at this point that Eustace has had this mystical experience, and he can't reject that anymore. Like he can't deny that it happened. And so that's why he's this, apologist or evangelist for the faith, if you will. I mean, we're obviously making some allusions and heaven forbid allegories here, but supposals, I should say.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't say that word.
Yeah, not the allegory word. But there are some supposals here in a way. But Eustace is not necessarily like sharing because he's passionate. He's like, oh, you've got to hear all about Narnia. It's so great. It's more like, how can I keep this inside anymore? Jill seems like she could really benefit from this, from Narnia. And so I almost, he feels compelled is right. How I read it.
Yeah. Because it's this wonderful thing and he wants to share it.
Mm-hmm. So they decide to call out to Aslan, and Eustace gives some very specific instructions. They're going to hold their hands out, palms down, like they did on Ramandu's Island. Now, I'll be honest, I don't remember this at all. We just read the book a couple of months ago. Do you remember them holding their hands out on the island? I
don't, but I think that we didn't get to see every single moment that happened on the island.
So do you think that this is Lewis, through Eustace's voice here, is talking about a time that we actually didn't read about?
Yes.
Interesting.
Little character-based exposition.
Very nice. There is a illustration, Phil, in my Kindle version here. And I guess I should remind listeners that I usually read from the Kindle, which has all of the illustrations that Baines did in color, and you have the horrid 7-volume series.
That's right, with the books out of order.
And with only one picture for each chapter.
Yeah, in black and white, which I'm okay with. I just wish there were more pictures.
Do you have the illustration in front of you of Eustace and Jill holding their arms out like zombies by a tree?
I do. That's the illustration for chapter 1.
Yeah, it's a really funny thing. It's a great illustration. Baines does a great job here. The colors are very, actually, I love this because it kind of alludes to, I can't say anything more, I don't want to spoil it, but some of the color choices that she uses here remind me a lot of some places that they will visit later on in this book. Is that confusing enough for you, Phil?
Yeah. I imagine that things later on will have some colors to it.
Yeah, that's true. The book will, when they get to the land of Narnia, it'll go from being in black and white to being in color. They'll meet Dorothy and everyone else along the way. But Baines uses...
I got that reference.
Good.
I understood that one.
Baines here uses lots of browns, mossy greens, and some tans here. And I think that makes sense as we get later on into the book. So I don't want to say anything else, though. Sorry. I know it's not fun for me to make allusions to things that make no sense to you.
I think it might be fun for a lot of people listening, though.
That's true. Yeah.
I'll allow it.
Yeah. They go through the marshes on their way to Rivendell. They're trying to get through. No, that's wrong book. Sorry. So let's keep moving on. Eustace and Jill, they call out to Aslan. And in the middle of this, let's call it a prayer. In the middle of this prayer, we hear a voice on the other side of the gym. One of the bullies looking. Actually, I think Lewis tells us it's not one of the bullies.
It's not. And this is so cool. There's the group of bullies, but there's also the group of suck-ups.
Yeah. the people, which is that's totally a thing, right? Anyone can remember bad experiences they had from grade school. And you've got the people who are not nice. And then you have the people who are mostly just silent, or they're kind of guilty of bullying in that they just don't really do anything. They're just like, yeah, he's over there. Just as long as it's not me, yeah, go get him, which is what they're doing to Jill.
Right.
Jill and Eustace make their way to a door, which has usually been locked, and it happens to be unlocked. And as they throw open this door, what they see surprises them. And I'm going to actually read a little bit from the book here. A moment before, both of them had meant to get through that doorway in double-quick time, if by any chance the door was not locked. But when the door actually opened, they both stood stock still, for what they saw was quite different from what they had expected. They had expected to see the gray, heathery slope of the moor going up and up to join the dull autumn sky. Instead, a blaze of sunshine met them. It poured through the doorway as the light of a June day pours into the garage when you open the door. It made the drops of water on the grass glitter like beads and showed up the dirtiness of Jill's tear-stained face. And the sunlight was coming from what certainly did look like a different world. What they could see of it, they saw smooth turf, smoother and brighter than Jill had ever seen before, and blue sky and darting to and fro, things so bright that they might have been jewels or huge butterflies. Oh man, I missed Lewis's description of Narnia.
The way he creates a fantastical world is just so appreciated.
Phil, I wanted to pause here for a second and go back to a common source that we often pull from as we read through these books, and that is Michael Ward and his two books, The Narnia Code and Planet Narnia, which really are sharing the same thesis. So just to remind listeners, and for anyone who is new, Michael Ward claims to have uncovered kind of a secret code inside of the Narnian books, and that each book corresponds to a different heavenly body from the medieval cosmology, the pre-Copernican cosmology of what the medievals and the ancients thought of the way that the heavens were laid out. So, Phil, I have a couple of questions for you. It's summer vacation for me right now. I don't have any students who I can annoy, and so I'm going to ask you three questions, which is, do you remember, I guess it's one question, do you remember what heavenly body was associated with each of the last three books?
Was Caspian Mars?
That is correct.
I think that's the one I'm going to remember.
Okay, that's fair. So that's right. Caspian was Mars, and we talked a lot about the martial imagery, a lot of the imagery of war throughout that book. We didn't, back in season 1 at all, talk about the way that the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is supposed to be associated with Jupiter. And maybe we'll find time in one of our hiatus episodes to get into that, because you and I didn't know about Michael Ward until season 2.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't remember talking about the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe one. So I feel like
we didn't.
I feel like this is the teacher's fault.
That is totally fair. I'll give you some bonus points on the quiz. And then last season, we talked about the Voyage of the Dawn Treader and Sol, the sun, right? Especially at the end of their journey across the Eastern Sea, we noticed how much there was imagery of the sun and how it grows brighter. And I think both you and I, correct me if I'm wrong, Phil, have both expressed that where we stand on this theory is we think it's a really, really great theory, and it makes it really fun to kind of uncover these in the books. But we're both not necessarily completely convinced that this was Lewis's intention.
And I think that this is part of the fun, because there's no letter, there's no like secret file of Lewis that says like, yes, I was planning it like this the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And it really gets you thinking, and I don't think I ever kind of want to know for sure. But I like thinking that like he did have this secret plan, but he never told anyone, and he left it so that people would dive even deeper into the work.
That's a good point. And we've noticed that while there are some connections that you and I are kind of iffy on, there are other ones that it's really hard for us to deny. And I want to talk about some of those here and kind of lay the foundation for us to explore Planet Narnia with the Silver Chair. And by the way, I'll link some of this stuff in the description, especially if you'd like to pick up his book. We usually pull from the Narnia Code as opposed to Planet Narnia, which is the more academic resource, because again, we're Narnia novices. We try to not be super academic about some of these things. So Michael Ward in the Narnia Code, he makes the connection that the Silver Chair is associated with the moon. And the medievals made a lot of connections in their time, as early as the 12th and 13th centuries. They made the connection about the moon and the tides, which we obviously know to be true now. The medievals were starting to make those connections as well too, which is, I think, surprising to a lot of us, because we assume that, they still thought a lot of things revolved around the earth, and yet they made these connections that the moon and the tides and the water are somehow connected. Because of that, there often is imagery of water and wetness associated with the moon. And so I think, Phil, that we should try to pay close attention to the way that water affects the atmosphere and the plot of this book. In fact, I want to read just a little paragraph here from the Narnia Code. Here's what Michael Ward has to say. Lewis has the moon's drenching, drizzling, dewy effects in mind throughout the Silver Chair. The theme is introduced at the very start of the story, when we first meet Jill Pole, who is crying on a damp little path. Eustace joins her sitting down on grass that was soaking wet. Lewis also describes drops that dripped off the laurel leaves, that drip off the leaves, and drops of water on the grass. These images, seemingly irrelevant to the plot, are there to help create a definite atmosphere.
Well, I'm convinced.
So I think it'll be fun. I definitely did, after reading what Professor Ward had to say, I went back and I reread the chapter, and I did see these stick out. And so it'll be interesting for us to continue to explore these.
I think so too.
All right, now back to the book.
So once they're in this new place, it's almost like the portal closes behind them very suddenly, because the girl Edith Jackal, she's still talking, and then all of a sudden her voice is cut off. They're completely now in this different world. And then they find themselves at the top of a very, very, very tall cliff. And I love the way this is described. It sounds impossibly tall.
So as they stand on the edge of this precipice, Jill decides that she's going to show Eustace how brave she is. And she's very, very foolish here. This is more foolish, I think, than locking yourself in a wardrobe without, putting that closed door behind you. Don't do that. We already know that. Here's something else you shouldn't do. You shouldn't stand on the top of a cliff. Jill does it. Eustace tries to keep her from falling, and he himself falls off the cliff. Lewis says he goes hurtling to the depths.
Yeah, which is terrifying.
What were your thoughts here as a first-time reader? Before we move into chapter 2, what do you think's happening to Eustace, or what is going to happen to Eustace? Do you think this is the end of him? He was just showing up at the beginning of the book. What do you think?
I didn't quite know what to think at first, and then I realized that we're one chapter in. He's probably going to come back.
Okay.
There have been movies, though. This is going to be a very funny reference, but have you seen G.I. Joe 2?
No, I have not seen G.I. Joe 2. Have you?
Yeah, I don't feel bad spoiling this for people. But
okay,
sometimes I feel like they get an actor to sign on, but they're like, you only have to show up for like 4 minutes. We're going to kind of transition to the new group, and we're going to kill you off real quick. And I feel like that's what this could have been. It's like, let's get Eustace to have a conversation with her, get her to Narnia, and then let's drop him off a cliff real quick.
I think this is the one and only time that anyone will make a connection between Narnia and G.I. Joe 2.
That's why we do what we do, to make these connections that no one else will see.
Yeah. All right, well, Phil, how should we end this chapter? Because there's one more surprise awaiting us.
Yeah, well, I think that the best way would be to read it directly from the book, because Lewis does such a great job revealing it. Fortunately, she was given no time to think over what she had done. Some huge, brightly colored animal had rushed to the edge of the cliff. It was lying down, leaning over, and, this was the odd thing, blowing. Not roaring or snorting, but just blowing from its wide-opened mouth, blowing out as steadily as a vacuum cleaner sucks in. Jill was lying so close to the creature that she could feel the breath vibrating steadily through its body. She was lying still because she couldn't get up. She was nearly fainting. Indeed, she had wished she could really faint, but faints don't come for the asking. At last she saw, far away below her, a tiny black speck floating away from the cliff, and slightly upwards. As it rose, it also got further away. By the time it was nearly on a level with the cliff top, it was so far off that she had lost sight of it. It was obviously moving away from them at a great speed. Jill couldn't help but thinking that the creature at her side was blowing it away. She turned and looked at the creature. It was a lion.
What a great cliffhanger to leave us on here.
Oh gosh.
That's like kind of your thing. I feel like that's one of your jokes.
Yeah. I'm just glad Aslan didn't blow it.
Well, Phil, what are your final thoughts here on this chapter before we move into listener feedback?
I just love how Lewis continues to change the structure of his stories. And it's very quickly becomes exciting and engrossing. And he does a great job of working with new characters and old characters together in a way that makes me want to keep reading.
And I think that's a great place for us to end this chapter. So next time we have chapter 2, and in that chapter, Jill receives some very specific instructions from Aslan.
Do we have any listener feedback?
We do. We have an email from a listener named Tyler, and Tyler answered a call that I put out at the end of Dawn Treader, where I was speaking about what we hope to be the ecumenical nature of our podcast, and I made the comment that I was like, well, I don't know if we've ever had anyone who is an Orthodox Christian reach out to us, and I now know that we do have some Orthodox listeners. So this email is from Tyler, and it is entitled Orthodox Listeners.
Let's hear it.
Daniel and Phil, I wanted to let you know that you have at least one Orthodox listener. I'm a recent convert to Orthodoxy, having been raised in a Southern Baptist church. I credit much of my conversion to C.S. Lewis. Reading his books really opened my heart to a sacramental worldview. I first read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a child, maybe 3rd grade, and quickly devoured the other 6 books, but alas, not in publication order. I'm now enjoying reading them with my children. My favorites would have to be Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Dawn Treader, and Magician's Nephew. And he makes a quote from one of the characters there, but I can't read it to you without spoiling anything, Phil. Yeah. He says, I'm a longtime listener to your podcast, and I love it. I look forward to next season. Hey, that's right now. And then further up and further in. Sincerely, Tyler. He also says, P.S. When you get time, please give That Hideous Strength another try. It is admittedly an odd duck of the trilogy, but it really is a fantastic book, and many of its themes are apt for our times. I've heard it said that it is Lewis's essay, The Abolition of Man, in story form. So maybe you could read the essay first to get a better feel for the book.
Wow.
Well, thank you so much, Tyler. That is such a great email for today, especially because we just mentioned, obviously, The Abolition of Man. And I think I need to. I mentioned that I read Out of the Silent Planet and Paralandra, and then I gave up on That Hideous Strength. So I do need to eventually revisit it.
Yeah, might be time.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for the email, Tyler.
All right, Phil, do you want to close us out?
Sure. This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you too would like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to Elias Dean, Hannah Anderson, John Marr, and Emily Margaret for supporting us at the Care Paravel level. You can follow us into Narnia on our Twitter or Facebook pages, and you can also email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. A review on Apple Podcasts would be great. It helps other people find the show. And we thank you for coming along on this journey, and we will be back next time with Chapter 2.